The world was at war. In Europe, Nazi Germany had unleashed its armies across the continent, and in the skies, the Luftwaffe ruled with terror. Allied cities burned. Britain barely survived. The Soviet Union fought for its life. And across the ocean, in the factories of America, a new kind of weapon was being prepared. Not a fighter, not a tank, but something far more powerful, the industrial might of the United States. German spies scoffed when they first heard it. They laughed at the idea that Ford Motor Company claimed it could build a heavy bomber, an aircraft of over 1.5 million parts, the same way it built cars. A bomber every 63 minutes? To them, it was fantasy. But fantasy was about to become reality. And that reality would darken the skies of Europe with waves of liberators, proving that America's strength was not just in battle, but in the factories, the assembly lines, and the hands of ordinary workers. This is the story of Willow Run. This is the story of how laughter turned into shock, and shock turned into defeat. The impossible dream. The German intelligence reports seemed almost comical. In the summer of 1941, as the Second World War spread like wildfire across continents, spies operating inside the United States sent back word to Berlin that Henry Ford's company was attempting something insane. The Ford Motor Company, the pioneer of the automobile assembly line, was planning to build heavy bombers the same way it built cars. And not just a few. Ford promised one bomber every hour. To the German high command, the news was absurd. They laughed, not because they didn't believe Ford was capable of building airplanes, but because the very idea of mass-producing a machine as complex as a four-engine bomber seemed impossible. The Luftwaffe knew better than anyone. A heavy bomber was not a car. It wasn't a Model T rolling off a line in Detroit. It was a beast of engineering, composed of more than 1.5 million parts, each requiring precision. Wings longer than a city bus, engines with thousands of intricate pieces, miles of wiring, hydraulics, electronics, gun turrets, oxygen systems. Each aircraft demanded handcrafting, months of labor, and teams of skilled technicians. And yet, in the United States, Henry Ford had declared he would build them as if they were Fords rolling down a line. The urgency of war. The United States had not yet entered the war, but Franklin Roosevelt's administration already understood the stakes. Britain was barely hanging on, bombed nightly by the Luftwaffe. The Soviet Union had just been invaded by Hitler's armies, and Nazi forces seemed unstoppable. The Allies desperately needed more planes, and they needed them faster than traditional methods could ever provide. The U.S. Army Air Forces placed its hopes on the consolidated B-24 Liberator. With its 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, its maximum bomb load of 8,000 pounds, and its range of over 2,000 miles, it was the weapon that could carry the war into the heart of Germany and Japan. But producing thousands of B-24s by hand would take too long. America needed an industrial miracle. Henry Ford was reluctant at first. He was already an old man by 1941, set in his ways, and he had never hidden his skepticism about getting involved in foreign wars. But his son, Edsel Ford, and his executives persuaded him. They saw the challenge not as impossible, but as an opportunity. If Ford had once revolutionized the world with the moving assembly line, why couldn't he do it again for the war effort? Building Willow Run. The decision led to the birth of a factory unlike anything the world had ever seen. Willow Run in Ypsilanti, Michigan. It would stretch nearly a mile long, covering 3.5 million square feet under a single roof. Designed specifically for bomber production, it was larger than many small towns. Its assembly line was so massive that it actually curved at one point, because the building was too long to fit on the available land. Inside, the plan was ambitious. Break down the B-24 into sections: nose, fuselage, wings, tail, and then move those sections down parallel lines until they converged into one completed aircraft. What had once taken months would, in theory, be reduced to hours. But there was a problem. Cars were simple. Bombers were not. Early attempts were a disaster. Workers recruited from farms, shops, and kitchens had never seen an aircraft before. Rivets were placed incorrectly, panels didn't fit, wiring harnesses were tangled. The first Liberators built at Willow Run were riddled with defects. Some couldn't even fly without major rework. Skeptics pointed to the failures as proof that Ford's dream was fantasy. German intelligence gleefully reported these struggles back to Berlin. The Reich's analysts nodded with smug satisfaction. See, they told themselves, the Americans have bitten off more than they can chew. But the Americans were learning, and learning fast. The Workforce Army. By 1942, Willow Run's workforce had swelled to tens of thousands. Many were women, answering the call as their husbands and brothers fought overseas. Rosie the Riveter was not just propaganda, she was real. Women drilled, bolted, riveted, and welded, often working long shifts in conditions that were hot, noisy, and relentless. African American workers joined in as well, despite facing segregation and discrimination, determined to contribute to the arsenal of democracy. Training programs were created to transform ordinary citizens into aircraft builders. High school graduates learned how to wire instrument panels. Housewives learned to drill rivets with precision. Farmers learned to assemble engines. Everyone had a role. Soon, efficiency improved. Teams specialized in their tasks. Quality inspectors ensured mistakes were caught early. Engineers redesigned jigs and tools to fit bomber parts perfectly. Each day, the process became smoother. German doubts. Meanwhile, German intelligence was receiving new reports. The Americans weren't giving up. On the contrary, they were doubling down. New machinery was being installed. Rail lines were feeding the factory with endless supplies of aluminum, steel, and engines. Workers were flooding into Michigan from across the Midwest, drawn by steady wages and patriotic duty. The Germans didn't believe it. Even when reports claimed that the Americans were preparing to produce hundreds of bombers per month, the Reich's leadership scoffed. Nazi planners had seen their own aircraft production crippled by shortages of fuel, aluminum, and labor. They couldn't imagine anyone achieving such scale. And yet, behind the walls of Willow Run, a revolution was underway. Every problem solved brought the Americans closer to an assembly line that would not just meet expectations, but shatter them. Henry Ford had promised the impossible, and soon impossibility would become reality. The assembly line of war. When Willow Run first opened its doors, it was less a factory and more a gamble in steel and concrete. Inside its cavernous halls, the dream of turning aircraft production into an industrial conveyor belt collided with harsh reality. The B-24 Liberator was not a Model T, and the early months proved it brutally. The first bombers that rolled out of Willow Run were riddled with flaws. Panels didn't align, rivets popped loose under stress, hydraulic lines leaked, electrical systems misfired. Some planes needed weeks of rework before they could even attempt to fly. Skeptics whispered that the Germans had been right. You couldn't build a heavy bomber the same way you built a sedan. But Ford engineers did not quit. They studied every bottleneck, every failure, every wasted motion. The problem wasn't the dream, it was the process. Step by step, they re-engineered the line. Specialized jigs were introduced so parts fit with millimeter precision. Conveyor belts were adjusted so fuselage sections and wing assemblies could flow smoothly. Quality control inspectors were stationed at every stage, trained to spot flaws before they multiplied. Slowly, order emerged from chaos. Specialization and speed. The secret was specialization. Instead of teams building entire components, thousands of workers each mastered a single task. One group drilled rivet holes. Another group fastened the rivets. A third group tested wiring harnesses. It was the Ford principle applied to aviation. Break a massive task into thousands of small, repeatable steps. Soon, Willow Run became a machine of human rhythm. Women known as Rosie the Riveters worked in pairs, their drills echoing like machine gun fire across the factory floor. Men who once plowed fields now hoisted engines into place with precision cranes. Entire wings, longer than many town streets, glided down the line on custom-built platforms. Workers didn't need to understand the whole bomber. They only needed to perfect their step. And it worked. By the middle of 1942, production was climbing. Where once a bomber took months, now it could be assembled in weeks. And the pace kept accelerating. By late 1943, Willow Run was producing Liberators at a speed the world had never seen. At its peak, A completed B-24 emerged from the end of the line every 63 minutes. Think about that. A 4-engine bomber with over 1.5 million parts, 360,000 rivets, and 9 miles of wiring, rolling off the line in less time than it took to watch a feature-length film. The human army. Willow Run employed more than 42,000 workers at its height. They came from every walk of life. Farmers, shop clerks, teachers, mothers, and high school graduates barely old enough to drive. For many, it was their first job outside the home or farm. They trained on the spot, learning to rivet, weld, solder, or wire. It was a place of contrasts. On the one hand, Willow Run was a marvel of modern engineering, with machines so large they shook the ground when they moved. On the other, it was deeply human. Workers bringing their children to day-care centers built inside the plant, women packing lunches before a 12-hour shift, men falling asleep on benches between rotations. It was a city inside a building, alive 24 hours a day. African American workers played a crucial role too, though they faced discrimination and segregation. Many fought for their right to be hired, then proved themselves indispensable on the line. For them, Willow Run was more than a job. It was a chance to prove their worth and claim their place in the arsenal of democracy. Shockwaves abroad. While Ford perfected his miracle factory, German spies kept sending back reports. At first, Berlin dismissed them. The idea that America could mass-produce heavy bombers sounded like wishful thinking. But the numbers grew harder to ignore. By 1943, Willow Run was producing hundreds of bombers every month. Entire air groups were equipped solely with B-24s rolling out of Michigan. German intelligence noted with alarm that the Americans had not only solved their early problems but were now outproducing Germany by orders of magnitude. Inside the Reich, production was strangled by shortages of raw materials, constant Allied bombing, and reliance on forced labor. A Luftwaffe plant might take weeks to assemble a bomber under dangerous conditions. Meanwhile, in Michigan, ordinary citizens were spitting out B-24s faster than the Reich could count them. The arsenal of democracy. What Willow Run proved was bigger than one factory. It proved that America could turn its entire industrial base into a war machine. Automakers built tanks, shipyards launched destroyers, and Ford built bombers. The arsenal of democracy was not just a phrase, it was a reality, and Willow Run was its beating heart. Each completed Liberator carried with it the fingerprints of thousands of ordinary Americans. Each was a message to Berlin. We can outbuild you, we can outlast you, and we will overwhelm you. And yet, the greatest impact was still to come. For what Willow Run produced was not just machines, but shockwaves of fear. German generals, once so dismissive, began to realize that they were facing not just soldiers on the battlefield, but an enemy with limitless industrial power. Every 63 minutes, another bomber rolled off the line. Every 63 minutes, the Luftwaffe's chances of winning the war grew smaller. The laughter in Berlin was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous. Dread. Shockwaves of Willow Run. By 1944, the skies over Europe told a new story. At dawn, German civilians and soldiers looked up and saw it. Formations of B-24 Liberators stretching across the horizon, their engines a thunder that shook the ground. They came not in dozens, but in hundreds. Each one carried bombs forged in America's factories, fuel siphoned through America's pipelines, and parts assembled by the hands of ordinary American citizens. Many of those bombers were born in a single place, Willow Run, the arsenal unleashed. By war's end, Willow Run alone had produced over 8,600 B-24 Liberators. Combined with other plants, more than 18,000 were built, making the Liberator the most produced heavy bomber in history. To put that into perspective, Germany's entire Luftwaffe bomber force never reached such numbers, not even close. Day after day, the Willow Run bombers flew missions across occupied Europe. They struck rail yards, oil refineries, and weapons factories. They crippled German fuel supplies by hammering the oil fields at Ploiești. They broke supply chains by bombing bridges, depots, and ports. They darkened the skies in such numbers that German civilians called them Fliegenfestungen, flying fortresses, though that term was meant for the B-17. To those on the ground, the difference hardly mattered. Both were harbingers of destruction. For German pilots, the numbers were soul-crushing. One Luftwaffe veteran remembered, "For every bomber we shot down, more returned the next day. It was like fighting the ocean. You could not stop it." German intelligence. From laughter to silence. The spies who had once mocked Ford's ambition now filed grim reports. They described a plant that operated like a city, where shifts never stopped, and where an aircraft as complex as a B-24 rolled off the line every 63 minutes. They admitted that American women, farmers, and teenagers were building bombers faster than Germany's slave labor factories could build anything. Berlin could hardly believe it. Hitler's ministers argued over the reports. Some dismissed them as exaggeration. Others, especially Luftwaffe officers, knew they were true, because they were the ones facing the swarms of bombers in the skies. German war planners realized something devastating. The Reich could not win a production war. They could build innovative weapons, jet fighters, rocket systems, and even the terrifying V-2. But they could not match the overwhelming industrial tide of the United States. Willow Run was the proof. The human story. Yet Willow Run's legacy was not only in steel and aluminum. It was in people. The 42,000 workers who built the bombers were as diverse as America itself. Women who had never worked outside the home mastered riveting and welding. African Americans, fighting both prejudice and war, proved their skill on the line. Farmers who once drove tractors now assembled engines that carried crews over Berlin. Inside the factory, life was relentless but proud. Cafeterias served thousands of meals a day. On-site child care let mothers work their shifts. Union halls buzzed with debates about wages and hours, but patriotism kept most disputes in check. Everyone knew the stakes. Every rivet drilled, every wire connected, every engine tested meant another bomber in the sky, another strike against tyranny. One worker later recalled, "We didn't fight with rifles. We fought with our hands, our drills, and our sweat. And we knew the boys overseas depended on us." The legacy of Willow Run. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was broken. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Allied bombers roamed almost unchallenged, dismantling the Reich's war economy piece by piece. The skies that Germany had once dominated were now ruled by Allied air power, and the Liberator was at the heart of it. Willow Run became a symbol of the arsenal of democracy. It showed the world that America could do what no other nation could: mobilize an entire society to produce at a scale that defied imagination. What once seemed impossible, a bomber built like a car, rolling off an assembly line every hour, had become not only possible, but unstoppable. When the war ended, the factory closed. Its mile-long assembly line fell silent. But its legacy endured. Willow Run had changed warfare forever. It proved that modern wars are not won only by courage on the battlefield, but by the relentless power of logistics and production at home. The final shock. For the German generals, it was a bitter lesson. They had laughed at the notion of Ford building a bomber every hour. They had ridiculed the idea of mass-produced heavy aircraft. But the laughter had died in the skies over Europe, drowned out by the roar of thousands of American engines. One spy's final report, captured after the war, summed it up with chilling simplicity: "They build faster than we can destroy." That was Willow Run's legacy. Every 63 minutes, a bomber was born. Every 63 minutes, America's industrial power made the impossible real. And every 63 minutes, Germany's hope for victory slipped further away. Willow Run was not just a factory. It was the place where laughter turned to silence, and where America proved that in war, steel, speed, and willpower could win the skies. Epic, SI memorable. By the end of the war, Willow Run had produced over 8,600 B-24 Liberators. Across America, more than 18,000 were built. The skies of Europe filled with bombers, so many that German soldiers described it as fighting a storm that never ended. The factory that spies once mocked had become a symbol of the arsenal of democracy. Its workers, men, women, black and white, farmers and clerks, veterans and teenagers, had proven that war could be fought and won not only on the battlefield, but on the assembly line. German generals had laughed. They had dismissed America as wasteful, soft, incapable of precision. But when waves of bombers rolled overhead, fueled by Ford's miracle factory, the laughter died. Willow Run was more than a plant. It was proof that industrial willpower could decide a war. Every 63 minutes, America built a bomber. Every 63 minutes, the Reich slipped closer to defeat. And in that relentless rhythm of engines and rivets, history was written. The world learned that in modern war, the side that can build faster wins.